Have you found the calling on your life? I think so many of us spend so long searching for exactly what the calling is that is on our individual life that often we miss the bigger picture that God has set out for us. You see, if you look through the Bible, very often God doesn't give somebody a really specific calling. I can think of a couple of examples where he did. If you look at Moses throughout the book of Exodus, then he's leading people, and that starts with the burning bush in Exodus 3. And equally, we see Joseph with his dreams in Genesis 37 that then get fulfilled all the way through to Genesis 45. So I'm not saying for a second that God doesn't have specific callings on specific people, because scripture themselves tell me that they do and that that's true. However, if we look at more people in the Bible, very often what I find is that God gives people gifts. God blesses people who are honoring to Him, that God wants to use people and their situation and the things that they have around them in order to glorify Him. And when I look at my own personal situation and think about Grace and I planting a church at the moment, I have to ask myself, was I specifically called to plant a church in Buckingham? And honestly, I don't think I was. Not to say that I'm doing the wrong thing or that I've missed my calling, but if I was specifically called to plant a vineyard church in Buckingham, then that rules out a lot of other possibilities. And that's just not quite how I think that God sees the situation. For example, what if we'd chosen to live somewhere else apart from Buckingham? Or what if an unfortunate event meant that we had to move elsewhere to look after an unwell family member or something like that? And we settle in that town and we choose to plant a vineyard church. Does God stop blessing that church because that wasn't our calling? I don't think He does. What if we had chosen to plant a church, but it wasn't with Vineyard and it had ended up being belonging to another denomination? Would God not have worked through us? Would God not have blessed that church? I think He would have done still. And what if I'd chosen not to go into ministry at all? What if I looked at the influence that I had in my workplace, in my family, in my friendship groups, and then I chose to utilize those situations to glorify God? Would He not bless those? The God that I know, the God that I love, the God that I'm still learning so much about, absolutely would bless those situations, because the bigger picture is that He wants me to glorify Him. He wants me to share the good news, and I'm still doing that through the situation that I find myself in. And it says things like this all the way through the New Testament, particularly in the book of Matthew. And Jesus is speaking, and there's a couple of examples that I just want to point out. First of all, it talks in Matthew 28 of going and making disciples of all nations, of baptizing people. That's the great commandment that we're given, is to go out and speak to people, to share the good news. And then equally, we've got in Matthew 22, when Jesus is asked, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus is clear about it. He says, the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God and to love your neighbor as yourself. So does that look like planting a vineyard church? I don't know. For us, it does. I look at the gifts that God has given me. I look at my ability to have a vision and carry it through, to work hard, to be able to pull people together, to be able to lead a team, to be able to speak on a stage. And I think, well, I love doing all of those things, and I love God, and I want to share more about Him with other people. And then we look at Grace as well and the gifts that she's got. And she's an incredible worship leader. She's brilliant at compassion ministry. She gathers people together. She also works hard. She runs an amazing party. If you haven't been to one of her parties, get along to one because they're always good fun. You'll always leave well fed, enjoying everyone's company. She does a great job with it. And so when we look at our gifts together, that we're able to host people, we're able to have a vision, we're able to run an organization, we're able to work hard, we're able to lead, we're able to preach, we're able to pray, we're able to support and love other people. That starts to look like a church. But the calling on our lives was much bigger than just a specific church plant. The calling on our lives was to go out and tell all nations, was to love our neighbours as ourselves, to love our God. And I believe that loving God and loving your neighbour is going to look different for different people. But by finding the way that you're able to love other people, whether it's through planting a church, through making a meal for somebody who's in need, giving a lift to someone that's at hospital, maybe it's by reaching out and sending a message to someone that you know is struggling at the moment, making time for a coffee. They seem small, they seem insignificant. But when I read my Bible, I see that that's exactly what God has called us to do. So the question shouldn't be one of what's the specific calling on my life, because very often it's not as specific as we saw with Moses and Joseph. But step back for a second. This week, if you get an opportunity, step back from what it is you're doing. Reassess your life. Reassess the gifts that God has given you to be able to use. Look at whether you're a good cook, a good friend, good on social media, good at websites, good at speaking on stage, good at making time for people, whether you've been blessed with the ability to make more time, to make another space around your table, whether you've got influence in the place that you're working, whether you're a decision maker, a visionary. Everything that you have can be used to glorify God. And the gifts that you have are exactly that. They're gifts. They're things that God has given you out of His graciousness, out of His goodness, to use in a way that you choose. And He's asked you to use them in a specific way, to love Him and to love your neighbour. So this week, that's it. What gifts have you got? And how are you going to use them this week and going forward to love your God, to love your neighbour as yourself, and to glorify Him, and through that, to find your calling that God has put on your life?